In this presentation, we'll discuss about the political and cultural context of Italy in the 19th century. So the age from Restoration, 1815, the Congress of Vienna, to the process of Risorgimento, so the resurgence of Italy, which will lead to the political unification of the peninsula. So we'll talk about the political and cultural push for the creation of Italy as a unified country, so what precedes the actual unification in 1861. We'll talk about the military phase of the Risorgimento with the independence wars, and we'll talk about the unification of Italy and the problems of the new nation after its geographic and political unification. Now, we have to start from here, 1815, the map of Europe after the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna is a congress that basically establishes the new political order of Europe after the Napoleonic era. So basically, Europe returns to the 1789 order. Just to give you a sense, this was Europe in 1812, so the maximum expansion of Napoleon's dominion. Napoleon is defeated in Waterloo and is sent to exile in the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean. And he will die 6 years later, 6 years after the Congress of Vienna, that inaugurates the Age of Restoration. He will die on May 5th, 1821. So this event is a particular event because it kind of opens up a new revolutionary spirit. So basically, with the death of Napoleon, there is a new sense of relief and freedom in Europe. Like the dictator as dead. And this is saluted in a very famous poem by an Italian romantic poet, Alessandro Manzoni, which is entitled Cinque Maggio, so May 5th. And the poem is quite a masterpiece of Italian literature. It's very long, I won't read it all, but it just gives the sense of the impact of the death of this very powerful man on humanity, so how the news of his death reaches Europe. So here is the very famous beginning. Ei fu siccome immobile. He is no more. He imagines the death, the moment of death of this powerful man. As reft of breath, the heedless body lay at last, on whom such boundless hopes were cast, immobile in the calm of death. So by the tidings, in amaze, the earth is held, and with her gaze, the parting hour doth mutely scan of this great spirit. If again upon the dust of her wide plain, all blooded, besprinkled, ever can the footfall of a mortal show like unto his she doth know. So this is a civil poem by Manzoni that inaugurates in 1821 really a moment of resurgence, also political resurgence in Italy. Now this is the map of Italy in 1815 after the Congress of Vienna. So as you can see, Italy returns to be a very fragmented geographical area. So there is a peninsula, but a very divided political situation, which includes a unified south under the Bourbon dynasty and the pontifical state, the papal states in central Italy. And the north is divided between the Grand Duchy of Tuscany and the Republic of Venice, a few duchies in Emilia-Romagna, and above all the Kingdom of Sardinia and Piedmont under the Savoia monarchy. So the Risorgimento is really both a political process of unification and a cultural process where the national Italian identity is constructed. So politics and culture go together. And with regard to politics, 1821 is a key date, as we saw with Napoleon. It's the beginning of the first revolutionary insurrections and movements, the organization of the Carboneria, which was like a secret patriotic organization. So in 1821 and 1831, there are like famous insurrections that are kind of like preparations to a more organized and structured political uprising and military uprising, which will start in coincidence with the European uprisings of 1848. Now, this political movement has as its maître à penser, like its thinker, the figure of Giuseppe Mazzini, who will become kind of the philosopher behind this political uprising. Now, with regard to the cultural context, we have to use instead the word romanticism, which is intimately connected to the awakening of a political desire and economic and financial desire to unify the nation. When we talk about romanticism, we have to talk about the three crowns of the 19th century, three poets that really created the cultural background to develop then a political actions. So they are like Ugo Foscolo, Giacomo Leopardi, and Alessandro Manzoni. So romanticism has two souls, like a Schopenhauer or Kierkegaard soul, which puts the emphasis on passions, great ideals, like the nation, the pursuit of the absolute, especially surrounding the figure of the genius. And another soul, which goes back to the philosophy of Hegel, which is related to the construction of a broad sense of nature and of history as a providential history of progress of nations, and the history of the spirit of nations that unfolds. So this is tied with the formation of a national spirit, with the creation of bourgeoisie, so and realism. A renewed realism as a way to educate the new bourgeoisie to take hold of power and kind of overturn monarchies. Now, another great figure of the Italian Risorgimento, Romanticism and Risorgimento is the figure of the composer Giuseppe Verdi, and the impact of his work on opera and melodrama on the political formation of Italians. So theater really becomes like a place where the patriotic feelings and expectations are created. Now, to go back to the writers that I mentioned, well, the first one, Ugo Foscolo, establishes in a way the roots of an Italian culture in its past. So in his long poem dedicated to sepulchres, so the importance of burial, he dedicates like a section of the poem, a very important section of the poem, to the Florentine church of Santa Croce, where the tombs of the great Italians of the past are collected. And Foscolo observes these tombs as a reminder that the feats of these past geniuses of the Italian spirit are there for us to be emulated. So the political uprising starts with taking awareness of Italy's great past. So Santa Croce is the site of the tomb of Michelangelo. Dante, even though Dante is actually buried in Ravenna, that's kind of like a monument to him. The tomb of Machiavelli, the tomb of Galileo, and Alfieri, a great contemporary poet. Now, this is a similar dynamics to what happens in other nations. So, for example, the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey in London, the site where the memories of the past of the greats of the nations are stored, or in the Pantheon in Paris, so the great French intellectuals, or even in the United States, for example, in the Washington, D.C. memorials dedicated to the great presidents, but also the soldiers that fought in several wars. So the memory of the past of those who died before us as an inspiration to pursue equal feats. With regard to Leopardi and Manzoni, well, Leopardi is a very famous poet. He's the poet of the Canti, like a lyrical poet. One of his poems, All'Italia, to Italy, is really a call to resurgence. It's a call to Italy to renew its ancient glories. So it's kind of like the cultural soil for the creation of a political movement, what we know as Risorgimento. And Manzoni, who writes like the most important novel of the 19th century, I Promessi Sposi, The Betrothed, which is basically telling a story that is set in the 17th century in Lombardy under Spanish domination, as a way to describe indirectly the need for northern Italians to the oppression of northern Italians under Austrian domination in the 19th century. So northern Italy was still under Vienna. And also, the Promessi Sposi is a novel that provides Italians with a standard language. The contribution by Manzoni in the novel is really to create a common language across the peninsula, a peninsula that was still divided in kind of city-state, the tradition of city-states, the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and with the city-states tradition also the tradition of like languages and dialects that were different for each state. So the novel provides this standard Italian for a new nation. With regard to Verdi, I want to point out the importance of opera and stories as a way to stage the political situation. Like the most important story in Verdi's operas, there's an incredible repertoire of operas, but I want to point out the most famous piece, aria of the opera Nabucco, which was premiered in 1842 in Milan under Austrian domination. So basically the story of Nabucco is the biblical story of the Israelites in their captivity in Babylon. And that becomes a metaphor for Italians themselves as in a state of captivity and in search, like the Israelites, of their promised land, of their independence. Well, the most important aria of this opera, kind of reflexive moment, is the so-called Va Pensiero. So the thought of the Israelites of their promised land while they are exiled. So fly thought on wings of gold, go settle upon the slopes and the hills, where soft and mild the sweet airs of our native land smell fragrant. Greet the banks of the Jordan and Zion's toppled towers. And then the invocation, O my country, so beautiful and lost. So, O mia patria, si bella e perduta. The idea of the homeland as beautiful and yet lost. And O remembrance, so dear and so fatal. This is the famous piece. So now this is, of course, a very famous piece, and it basically projects an idea of the homeland to be reconquered, and the homeland as a new promised land from the exile. Now, the equivalent of the patria bella e perduta, of the homeland that is beautiful and lost, is in painting offered by Francesco Hayez, who is like the most important romantic painter of the age. Once again, the representation of Italy is a representation of a beautiful woman that is lost or mistreated and not revered as it should be. Francesco Hayez is also the painter of the famous Kiss, so 1859, that basically stages in his romantic painting the political union between Italy and France that took place in 1858. And the two dates, 1848 and 1859, of the two paintings by Hayez, in a way sum up the political process of the transformation of a movement from a cultural, like Risorgimento, from a cultural and political activism to an organized military campaign. Now, this is the situation of Italy in 1848, at the beginning of the independence war, so the military phase of the Risorgimento. And so this is the image that we saw of the Italia Bella e Perduta. It's the image at the end of the first independence war, which starts in coincidence with the European uprising and ends in the defeat of the Kingdom of Piedmont and Savoia, that and the Sardinia, that under the Savoia monarchy starts this military process. Now, in the Kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia, the king was King Carlo Alberto, who was actually the king that promulgated a sort of constitution, a statute, really, in 1848, that allowed certain reformations in the monarchy structure of the kingdom. The statute will actually be in effect until 1945 in Italy. Now, Piedmont will wage war against Austria in Lombardy and Veneto, so in northern Italy, but is defeated in Custoza and Novara. So the king is forced to withdraw, and basically also the contemporary attempt of Mazzini to found like a republic in Rome, especially given the openness of the new pontiff, Pope Pius IX, especially in the first couple of years, to kind of reform. Even the experience of the Roman Republic in light of the defeat of Piedmont fails. So the first World War actually, first independence war actually ends with the abdication of Carlo Alberto and the ascent to the throne of the new king, Victor Emmanuel II. So in the 1850s, Piedmont starts to acquire the new means to conduct a second campaign after the loss in the first independence war. And King Victor Emmanuel II actually, it's one of the founding fathers of the nation, with Garibaldi, Cavour, and Mazzini in the picture, actually has as his prime minister Camillo Benso Conte di Cavour. So the prime minister Cavour actually develops a program to confiscate church properties in the name of free church and free state as a way to build an army and to build kind of a wealth for the Kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia. Now, he also develops like a very interesting diplomatic strategy. So in 1855, Camillo Benso Conte di Cavour sends Piedmontese troops in a war that is far away, so the Crimean War, in the peninsula of Crimea in Russia. as a way to sit in the table of winners and to show Italy's, or like the Kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia's involvement in international affairs. Now, this will lead a few years later, so 3 years later, to the Treaties of Plombières. So a treaties of basically where Italians agree with French to have the French army intervene in case of Austrian aggression to the Piedmont territory. So this agreement with French is once again represented in the kiss, which is a political metaphor of the agreement of Italy and France. So this will lead to the Second Independence War, which is a war that is born out of Piedmont forcing the Austrian invasion of Piedmont. So basically, the Piedmontese troops are lined up at the border with Lombardy as a way to intimidate the Austrians and cause them to attack and trickle the mechanism of the treaties of Plombières, where in case of attack, the French army would help the Piedmontese. So that is what happens, and this is why in the campaign of Lombardy, the Piedmontese and the French army obtain a victory in San Martino and Solferino, so conquering Lombardy. At the same time, the Second Independence War unfolds in the south with the so-called Expedition of the Thousand, leaving from Genoa and leading with the figure of the war hero Garibaldi, who had fought in South America previously, to the conquest of Sicily and the kingdom of the two Sicilies. Garibaldi will arrive really close to Rome, and he will stop before the city out of obedience to King Victor Emmanuel, who decided to leave Rome as part of the pontifical state. Now, the central regions of Italy, in the meantime, basically run plebiscites to be connected to the new Italian kingdom. So basically, the Second War of Independence allows the expansion of the Piedmontese state to Lombardy and the southern regions, and the annexation of the central regions via plebiscite to the new kingdom. So in March 1861, Italian unification is completed as a political entity. The capital of the nation is Turin, and since 1865 will be moved to Florence as a way to get closer to the natural capital city of Rome. So in 1861, Italy is unified, but it still lacks Venice and Rome. This is the content of the Third War of Independence, which Italy, the new nation, fights against Austria for the liberation of Venice. So basically, the war is lost. Italians lose against the Austrians in Lissa, but by virtue of an alliance with Prussia, who was fighting a war against Austria and which won the war against Austria, Italy actually obtains Venice as a reward. So this is kind of like a victory through a loss that will kind of shed a light of shame in the political consciousness that will come back again during World War I. Now, 1870 is a key date because it's the day where Italians actually managed to seize the city of Rome, and it happens through, once again, an international context. So Prussia was involved in a war against France. France was kind of the political ally of the Pope, kind of the military arm of the Pope in case of need to defend the city of Rome. But since France was involved in a war with Prussia, a war that France lost in the Battle of Sedan, Italians actually took advantage of the situation to invade the city of Rome and conquest the city of Rome. Now, this will lead to a particular situation of the Pope, Pius IX, who will declare himself like prisoner in the Vatican. And we have a situation where the Pope is in the Vatican and Italy conquers the city of Rome and turns it into the capital of a monarchy. So we have like Pius IX and Victor Emmanuel II, who are the two kings of Rome. So Rome is a city that is capital of two kingdoms, a secular one, Italy, and kind of a clerical one, like the church, and has two kings. So this will lead to a situation of instability and to the so-called Roman issue. Now, this is Italy in its unified political form. The unification of Italy leads to several political problems. One is immediate. In the 1860s, it's the so-called Southern issue, where a number of citizens that were oppressed by the new taxes that the Piedmontese state imposed on the southern regions organized themselves as kind of an anti-state. This was a kind of a form of activism, but also kind of a military organization focusing around the figures of the brigands. So people who were fighting against the new dominator, perceived as a dominator, so the Piedmontese state. And this creation of an anti-state, or this war, which took place in the 4 years between 1862 and 1866, led to almost 200,000 victims and casualties. So this was an actual internal war. Imagine yourself, like, after unification, the year after, you have like such a war front in your own territory. This also will lead, is also seen as the preamble of the creation of mafia as a criminal anti-state or parallel state. The other issue that we mentioned is the Roman issue. So after the seizing of Rome, Pius IX declares the so-called non-expedit in 1874, basically imposing Catholics not to participate in the life of the new state. This ban will be removed in 1913 through the Gentiloni Pacts, when Catholics will be allowed again to vote. The Roman issue is the issue of a city with two kings, as we mentioned, and the coexistence of church and state in the same city. So Rome is the nation, the capital of the nation, and Rome is the capital of universal Catholicism. This Roman issue will last for 59 years, so until 1929, when the church and the state will reach an agreement which will lead to the creation of the Vatican City as a territorial power granted to the Pope, even if it's kind of a square mile. And the last issue of the new nation is basically a social issue, so the issue of how the nation should be industrialized. Industrialization is a little belated in Italy out of fear of the Commune, which was an event in France in 1871 that was sort of an experiment in a Marxist communist protest structure. So the social issue and the issue of industrialization, the issue of the movement of peasants from the countrysides to the cities and to the industries is first tackled actually in 1891 by an encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, the Rerum Novarum, which starts the Church's involvement in social issues, or the so-called social doctrine of the Church. The social issue is also related to strikes and poverty, which are two main causes for the great emigration of Italians from Italy to Europe and South and North America. So this is connected to the movement of Italians from their newly formed state to other nations. So this also was seen as a shame for the new Italian state, which was unable to provide resources for its citizens. Now, at the same time, the Risorgimento and its accomplishment leads to sort of a general feeling of dissatisfaction. So the Scapigliati movement in Milano is a movement of, we could call it like bohème writers who were dissatisfied with how the great ideas of the Risorgimento turned into sort of a political disappointment and a perception of a political unity, but cultural disunity that was still happening across the different cities of Italy. So at the same time, after the unification, there's a process of monumentalization of the Risorgimento through painting of battles. So this is Fattori, the Battle of Custoza, or the creation of memories. So this is the famous picture by Altobelli taken on September 21, 1870. So the breach in the Roman Porta Pia when Italians entered the city. This picture is actually a fake in the sense that the actual breach happened the day before, September 20th. September 20th is one of those dates that you will see a lot in Italian piazzas. But the picture is actually taken in pose the day after. So the monumentalization of the present events a posteriori. This is also Silvestro Lega, a painter who painted the death of Mazzini, the soul, the philosopher of the Risorgimento. Then the monumentalization of the Risorgimento happens through figures, literary figures. The most important one is Giosuè Carducci, like a patriotic, who starts with his poetry a secular celebration of the Risorgimento and starts to celebrate a new modern Italy as the heir of the ancient past of the Roman Empire, so the Third Rome. At the same time, Giosuè Carducci is animated by a very strong sense of anti-clericalism, which is infused in a lot of the Risorgimento tradition as a form of emancipation from the presence of the Catholic Church in Italy. So he's the singer of an anti-clericalism celebration of progress of the new nation. At the same time, the other great poet of the Risorgimento is Giovanni Pascoli, a patriotic poet that celebrates really the link between the ancient Rome and the new Rome, the so-called Third Rome, the Rome of the Empire being the first, the Baroque Rome the second, and the Italian secular Rome being the third. He's very sympathetic with the working classes, so the social issues, and he's very famous for his poetry of small things, so the celebration of rural life. Now, the years after the unification, like toward the end of the 19th century, are characterized by a heavy quest for modernity and heavy quest for a recognition in the context of modern nations of Europe. This period is basically divided into two parts, like the part of the right and the part of the so-called historic left. 1876 is the splitting date. When we talk about right and left, we're not dealing with the same categories of the present, but we're dealing with a context where 3% of the citizens could vote. So vote was based on wealth, on census. So we're dealing with historic left and right, not in our sense, but in this very reduced, narrow scope of citizenship. Now, the historic right after the wars has the problem of creating a national system of taxes. So to expand the tax system of Piedmont to all the other nations, and this is what we saw called generated the resistance in the southern regions, and also the creation of infrastructure, so railroad. The other issue is related to the war that we highlighted earlier between the North and the South, and the disparity between the Brigands' War, and also the tension with the Catholic Church and the Roman issue after the seizing of Rome. Now, the historic left has to face the end of the Risorgimento season in 1878 with the almost concomitant deaths of Pope Pius IX and Victor Emmanuel II, two great protagonists that are replaced by Pope Leo XIII and King Umberto, the son of Victor Emmanuel II. King Umberto will rule in Italy until year 1900, when he will be assassinated, and this whole age will be called the Umbertine Age. At the same time, the historic left has to deal with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and so the Exposition of Milan in 1881 launches this new process of industrialization of the city, of the nation, and launches at the same time kind of the new working class that emerges in the social fabric of the new state. So this working class or fourth state is represented in a famous painting by Pelizza da Volpedo, the fourth state, which is kind of a monumental canvas in pointillist technique. At the same time, the left has to deal with the illiteracy rate. So a lot of Italian citizens were actually unable to read and write. So the Coppino Law of 1877 actually makes it mandatory for Italian citizens to attend school, elementary school. And school becomes like a main factor also for the education and emancipation of women who are called to be part of bureaucracy and employment. So the emphasis of school is something that we see in two main publications of the 1880s. So the book Cuore by Edmondo De Amicis and The Adventures of Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi. Two books that are focusing on school and the need to be educated, to be literate, as a way to promote the ability of citizens to read and write. There is a final part of this historic left period that is dominated by the figure of Francesco Crispi, so 1887 to 1896. Francesco Crispi is a ruthless politician who pursued like an alliance with Austria and Prussia, so the militaristic monarchies of Austria and Prussia, as opposed to the democracies of France and England. So it's kind of like a militaristic phase, which often has been compared to kind of a precursor of, or what then will become the fascist approach to the creation, the management of state. Crispi pursues like a colonial agenda as a way to place Italy in the context of the modern nations in Africa. And however, his push will to have like a colony in Eritrea and in Ethiopia will fail after the colonial defeats of Dogali in 1887 and the most important defeat in 1896 of Adwa, where King Menelik of Ethiopians actually manages with his army to defeat for the first time a Western European nation. So this was a shock all over the world. Now, this period is characterized by two main figures in the literary political context. The figure of Giovanni Verga and Gabriele D'Annunzio. Giovanni Verga is the head of the school of so-called Verismo or naturalism. So a school that is very highly scientific, positivistic. So this is really the philosophy of the late 19th century. Verga was like a very worldly figure. He was coming from Sicily and moved to Milano, where he lived like a very worldly, mundane life. And he was like very involved with the celebration of the new progress of the nation and industrialization, but at the same time also was documenting with his naturalistic reports of the new industrialization the situation of the vinti, so the struggling classes that could not really emerge, and they were kind of pushed in their in terrible working situations. Now, on the other hand, we have Gabriele D'Annunzio and his aesthetism. So, a form of dandiness. He was like a dandy, sort of the Italian Oscar Wilde, and an emphasis on a perception of an age in constant state of decadence, where decadence in the English sense means both kind of thrill, excitement, sophisticatedness, and decay. So he was involved with fashion and also with the birth of cinema after 1896, and in general with the cultural industry. So this concludes our itinerary from the Congress of Vienna to Italy at the dawn of the 20th century, which is a nation at the dawn of its industrialization and emergence as a great European nation.